The divorce papers arrived at my office this morning while I was staring at our empty bank account. My wife moved out 3 days ago after I told her she was wrong about our money problems and that my mother was right about cutting expenses. 5 years of marriage ended because I chose my mom's financial advice over my wife's feelings during the worst crisis of our relationship. Our joint account shows $12.37. The mortgage payment is due in 6 days. My wife took half of our remaining savings when she left, which amounts to $800. She also canceled her contribution to household bills, leaving me responsible for payments I cannot afford alone. The financial spreadsheet my mother created to save our marriage has instead destroyed it completely. I am writing this from the house we bought together 2 years ago, which will probably be foreclosed within 60 days. My mother's frugal budgeting plan was supposed to solve our money problems, but it drove my wife away instead. Every room reminds me of arguments about organic groceries, daily coffee purchases, and takeout meals that my mother declared unnecessary expenses. My wife's final text message said that I had chosen my family of origin over my family of choice. She wrote that watching me agree with my mother's criticism of her spending habits was the most humiliating experience of her marriage. She said that my mother's spreadsheet felt like a weapon designed to prove that she was irresponsible and wasteful. The worst part is that my mother was probably right about our spending patterns. We were buying expensive coffee every day, ordering takeout 3 times per week, and purchasing organic groceries that cost twice as much as conventional alternatives. But being right about money did not make my mother right about how to treat my wife during a financial crisis. I thought I was supporting logical solutions to our problems. Instead, I was letting my mother humiliate my wife in her own home, while I nodded along with every criticism and suggestion. I defended my mother's harsh judgment by pointing out that she had successfully raised 3 children on a single income during the 1980s. But my wife was not living in the 1980s, and she was not my mother's child who needed financial discipline. She was my partner who deserved respect and collaboration during our crisis, not lectures from my mother about responsible spending habits. I realize this now, but the realization came too late to save my marriage. The house feels enormous and empty without her. I keep expecting to hear her car in the driveway or find her reading on the couch. Instead, I come home to silence and reminders of every fight we had about money, spending, and my mother's involvement in our private financial decisions. But let me take you back 3 months ago, when I lost my job and made the catastrophic decision to let my mother solve our money problems instead of working through them privately with my wife. 3 months ago, I lost my job when the marketing company where I worked for 7 years eliminated my entire department. The layoff was unexpected and devastating. I had been confident in my job security and had made financial commitments based on what I thought was stable employment. Suddenly, my wife and I were facing the prospect of surviving on her income alone while maintaining our mortgage, car payments, and other fixed expenses. My wife, Sarah, worked as a graphic designer for a small nonprofit organization. Her salary was decent but nowhere near enough to cover our full household budget. We had some savings, but not enough to last more than 2 or 3 months without my income. The situation was scary and stressful, but I thought we could handle it together if we were careful and smart about our choices. I immediately started looking for new employment, while Sarah took on additional freelance projects to increase her income. We both understood that we would need to reduce our spending temporarily until I found another job. We canceled our gym memberships, postponed vacation plans, and started eating out less frequently. But despite our efforts to cut costs, our savings continued to disappear faster than we had anticipated. Unemployment benefits helped, but they only replaced a fraction of my previous salary. We were burning through our emergency fund at an alarming rate, and I was becoming increasingly anxious about our financial future. That was when I made the decision that would ultimately destroy my marriage. Instead of continuing to work through our budget problems privately with Sarah, I asked my mother to help us figure out where we were going wrong with our money management. My mother had always been excellent with money. She raised 3 children as a single parent during the 1980s and 90s after my father left when I was 8 years old. Despite having limited income and resources, she managed to keep us fed, clothed, and housed while saving enough money to help all 3 of us pay for college tuition. Her financial discipline was legendary in our family. She clipped coupons religiously, bought generic brands exclusively, and never purchased anything that was not absolutely necessary. She cooked every meal at home, repaired items instead of replacing them, and found creative ways to stretch every dollar as far as possible. When I called her about our financial crisis, she immediately offered to help by reviewing our spending patterns and identifying areas where we could save money. She asked us to gather our bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts from the previous 3 months so she could analyze our expenses and create a comprehensive budget plan. Sarah was initially resistant to the idea of involving my mother in our private financial situation. She pointed out that we were adults who should be capable of managing our own money without parental intervention. She worried that asking my mother for help would set a precedent of running to our families whenever we encountered problems in our marriage. But I convinced her that my mother's expertise could help us identify spending habits we might not notice ourselves. I argued that her perspective as someone who had successfully managed money during difficult circumstances could provide valuable insights into how we could reduce our expenses more effectively. Sarah reluctantly agreed to let my mother review our finances, but she asked me to make it clear that we wanted suggestions rather than demands. She emphasized that any changes to our spending habits should be decisions we made together as a couple, rather than requirements imposed by my mother. When my mother came over the following weekend, She brought a laptop computer and several folders filled with budgeting worksheets and expense tracking forms. She had obviously prepared extensively for this financial consultation, and she approached our situation with the seriousness of a professional accountant. She spent 3 hours going through our bank statements and receipts with meticulous attention to detail. She categorized every expense, calculated monthly averages for different types of spending, and identified patterns in our purchasing behavior that we had never noticed ourselves. The results of her analysis were eye-opening and embarrassing. We were spending over $300 per month on coffee, restaurant meals, and convenience foods. Our grocery bills included expensive organic produce, premium brands, and specialty items that cost significantly more than basic alternatives. My mother presented her findings in a detailed spreadsheet that broke down our expenses into essential and non-essential categories. She had calculated exactly how much money we could save by making specific changes to our spending habits. Her recommendations included switching to generic brands, meal planning to reduce food waste, and eliminating all restaurant and coffee shop purchases. According to her calculations, implementing her suggestions would reduce our monthly expenses by over $800. This would allow us to maintain our current lifestyle without depleting our savings, while I continued searching for employment. Her plan seemed logical, comprehensive, and potentially life-saving for our financial situation. But Sarah did not react to my mother's presentation with the gratitude and enthusiasm that I had expected. Instead, she seemed hurt and defensive about having our spending habits analyzed and criticized by someone outside our marriage. She pointed out that many of the expenses my mother had labeled as wasteful were things that brought us joy and comfort during a stressful time. Sarah explained that our daily coffee shop visits were not just about caffeine consumption. They were opportunities for us to spend time together, escape the stress of job searching, and maintain some normalcy during an uncertain period. She said that buying organic groceries was important to her because she cared about supporting sustainable farming practices and avoiding pesticides. She also questioned whether some of my mother's cost-cutting suggestions were realistic for our lifestyle and circumstances. For example, my mother recommended that we shop at 3 different grocery stores each week to take advantage of various sales and promotions. Sarah pointed out that the time and gas money required for this strategy might not actually result in significant savings. My mother responded to Sarah's concerns by explaining that sacrifices were necessary during financial crises. She said that people who wanted to maintain their lifestyle during emergencies often found themselves in serious debt or bankruptcy. She argued that temporary discomfort was preferable to long-term financial devastation. She also suggested that Sarah's attachment to expensive groceries and coffee shop visits might indicate a lack of understanding about the seriousness of our situation. She said that people who had never experienced real financial hardship sometimes struggled to prioritize necessities over luxuries during difficult times. This comment clearly hurt Sarah's feelings. My mother continued explaining her philosophy about money management and personal responsibility. She said that financial discipline required making difficult choices, and that successful people learned to distinguish between wants and needs during challenging circumstances. I could see that Sarah was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with my mother's lecturing tone and implied criticism of her financial priorities. But I was impressed by the thoroughness of my mother's analysis and the potential savings her plan could provide. I thought that following her advice would solve our immediate problems and help us develop better long-term financial habits. So when Sarah expressed doubts about implementing all of my mother's suggestions, I found myself defending my mother's recommendations and encouraging Sarah to be more open-minded about making necessary changes to our spending patterns. I thought I was being logical and practical, but I was actually choosing my mother's perspective over my wife's feelings and preferences. The explosion happened 2 weeks after my mother presented her financial plan, and it was triggered by something as simple as a grocery shopping trip that went completely wrong. Sarah and I had been trying to follow my mother's budgeting recommendations, but we were struggling to implement all of her suggestions without constant arguments about every purchase decision. My mother had given us a detailed shopping list that specified exactly which brands to buy, which stores offered the best prices for different items, and how much we should spend in each category. She had also provided coupons she had collected and instructions for maximizing savings through store loyalty programs and promotional offers. Sarah found the entire process frustrating and demoralizing. She said that spending 45 minutes in the cereal aisle comparing prices per ounce on different brands made her feel like we were living in poverty, even though we still had some savings remaining. She complained that following my mother's system turned every shopping trip into a mathematical exercise rather than a normal household task. But I was committed to proving that my mother's plan could work for us. I had calculated that following her recommendations for just 1 month would save us enough money to cover 2 weeks of mortgage payments. I thought that Sarah would appreciate the financial benefits once she saw how much money we were saving. The problem was that Sarah was not seeing any benefits. Instead, she was experiencing the shopping process as time-consuming, stressful, and humiliating. She said that using multiple coupons and asking for price matches made her feel like other customers and cashiers were judging our financial situation. She also discovered that some of my mother's money-saving strategies were not as effective as advertised. The generic brands she recommended often required larger quantities to achieve the same results as name brands, which reduced the actual savings. The stores she suggested for different items were located far enough apart that the gas money and time required for multiple trips eliminated some of the financial advantages. When Sarah tried to discuss these problems with me, I defended my mother's advice by pointing out that any system required adjustment time and that we should give the plan a fair chance before abandoning it. I suggested that Sarah was being resistant to change, and that her complaints were preventing us from achieving the financial stability we desperately needed. This response made Sarah angry, because she felt like I was dismissing her legitimate concerns and experiences in favor of theoretical savings calculations. She said that I was treating my mother's opinions as more important than her actual daily struggles with implementing an impractical system. The situation reached a breaking point during our third week of following my mother's plan. Sarah had spent over 2 hours shopping for groceries using my mother's complicated system of store comparisons and coupon combinations. She came home exhausted and frustrated, carrying bags of generic products that she did not want to eat. When she started unpacking the groceries, she discovered that she had forgotten to buy coffee because it was not on my mother's approved shopping list. Coffee had been eliminated as an unnecessary expense that we could replace with homemade alternatives. But Sarah loved her morning coffee routine and had been looking forward to that small pleasure after a difficult shopping experience. She asked me to stop at the store on my way home from a job interview to pick up coffee, but I refused because it would violate my mother's budgeting guideline. I suggested that she could drink tea instead or learn to appreciate the coffee alternatives my mother had recommended. Sarah stared at me for a long moment and then said that she could not believe I was denying her a basic grocery item to comply with my mother's rules about her spending habits. She pointed out that a bag of coffee cost less than $10 and would last for 2 weeks, making it a reasonable expense even during our financial crisis. But I had become so invested in proving that my mother's plan could work that I was unwilling to make any exceptions or modifications. I told Sarah that success required commitment and that making small compromises would undermine the entire system. I said that if we started buying unauthorized items, we would gradually return to our previous spending patterns. Sarah became furious and accused me of caring more about my mother's approval than about her happiness and comfort. She said that I was treating her like a child who needed financial supervision rather than like a partner who deserved input into household decisions. She also pointed out that my mother was not the one who had to live with the consequences of her recommendations. My mother was not the one standing in grocery store lines with multiple coupons, driving to different stores for individual items, or eating generic products that tasted terrible compared to preferred brands. I responded by defending my mother's expertise and track record of financial success. I reminded Sarah that my mother had raised 3 children alone and managed to provide for our family during much more difficult circumstances than our current situation. I suggested that Sarah's resistance to proven strategies indicated a lack of appreciation for my mother's generous help. This was exactly the wrong thing to say. Right. Sarah exploded and told me that comparing her to my mother's children was insulting and inappropriate. She said that she was not my mother's child and did not need financial parenting from someone who had not been invited to make decisions about our marriage. She pointed out that my mother's financial success in the 1980s did not necessarily translate to effective strategies for our current situation. She argued that economic conditions, food prices, and lifestyle expectations had changed significantly since my mother was raising young children as a single parent. But I was too defensive and invested in my mother's plan to listen to Sarah's legitimate concerns. Instead of acknowledging that some modifications might be necessary, I accused her of being stubborn and resistant to helpful advice. I said that her negative attitude was preventing us from achieving financial stability. I told Sarah that my mother had spent hours analyzing our spending patterns and developing a comprehensive plan to help us survive our financial crisis. I said that rejecting her recommendations without giving them a fair trial was ungrateful and self-defeating. Then I made the statement that would end our marriage. I told Sarah that she was wrong about our financial situation and that my mother was right about the changes we needed to make. I said that my mother understood money management better than Sarah did and that following her advice was our best chance of avoiding bankruptcy. Sarah stared at me in complete shock. She could not believe that I had just declared my mother's judgment superior to hers about decisions that affected our daily life and marriage. She asked me whether I understood that I had just chosen my mother's opinions over my wife's feelings about her own household and lifestyle. I doubled down on my position because I genuinely believe that logic and financial expertise should override emotional preferences during a crisis. I told Sarah that my mother had proven her ability to manage money successfully under difficult circumstances, while our current situation proved that our previous approach had been inadequate. I said that my mother had raised 3 children on 1 income, while we could not even manage our household expenses with 2 incomes and no children. I suggested that Sarah should be grateful for my mother's willingness to share her knowledge, rather than resentful about having her spending habits analyzed and corrected. Sarah listened to this speech with an expression of growing disbelief and hurt. When I finished talking, she was quiet for several minutes. Then she said that watching me defend my mother's criticism of her lifestyle choices was the most humiliating experience of our marriage. She explained that my mother's presentation had felt like a judgment of her character and values, rather than a helpful analysis of our spending patterns. She said that having her husband agree with his mother's implied criticism made her feel like she was married to someone who did not respect her perspective or priorities. Sarah pointed out that my mother had not just suggested budget cuts. She had made moral judgments about which purchases were appropriate and which indicated character flaws or poor decision-making. She had implied that people who bought organic groceries or frequent coffee were irresponsible and lacking in financial discipline. Sarah said that I had essentially agreed with my mother's assessment that she was wasteful, irresponsible, and unable to make good decisions about money. She felt like I had invited my mother to criticize and correct her lifestyle choices while I acted as an enforcement agent for someone else's rules about our marriage. The argument continued for another hour, with both of us saying increasingly hurtful things about each other's priorities and decision-making abilities. But the damage was already done. I had chosen my mother's financial advice over my wife's emotional needs and relationship concerns. 3 days later, Sarah packed her clothes and moved in with her sister. She left a note explaining that she could not continue living with someone who treated his mother's opinions as more important than his wife's feelings. She said that my willingness to let my mother criticize and control our household decisions had destroyed her trust in our partnership. The divorce papers that arrived this morning include a detailed list of Sarah's complaints about our marriage and the specific incidents that led to her decision to end our relationship. Reading through her lawyer's description of our financial arguments was like seeing our marriage from a completely different perspective. According to the legal documents, Sarah felt that I had repeatedly prioritized my family of origin over our marriage by allowing my mother to make decisions about our household budget and lifestyle choices. She described feeling humiliated and disrespected when I defended my mother's criticism of her spending habits, instead of supporting her during a difficult time. The papers also mentioned that I had failed to establish appropriate boundaries with my mother regarding our private financial matters. Sarah's lawyer argues that inviting parental intervention in marital decisions without both partners' enthusiastic consent constitutes a breach of the partnership agreement that marriage represents. Reading these legal accusations forced me to confront how my actions must have appeared from Sarah's perspective. I had thought I was being logical and practical by seeking my mother's expertise during our financial crisis. But Sarah experienced my decision as a betrayal of our marriage and an indication that I valued my mother's approval more than her comfort and dignity. I realize now that my mother's financial advice came with hidden costs that I had not calculated. Yes, her recommendations could have saved us money on groceries and entertainment expenses. But implementing her plan required Sarah to accept criticism of her values and lifestyle choices from someone outside our marriage. My mother had not just suggested that we buy generic products and eat out less frequently. She had implied that people who chose organic groceries and regular coffee shop visits were financially irresponsible and lacking in proper priorities. She had presented her own frugal lifestyle as morally superior to our previous spending patterns. When I defended my mother's recommendations, I was essentially agreeing with her judgment that Sarah's preferences were wrong and that my mother's values were more appropriate for our household. I was asking Sarah to change fundamental aspects of her lifestyle to conform to standards set by someone who had no stake in our daily happiness or relationship satisfaction. The financial crisis that brought my mother into our marriage was temporary and manageable. I have since found a new job that pays slightly more than my previous position. Our savings account is recovering, and we could have eventually resolved our money problems without outside intervention. But the damage to my marriage from involving my mother in our private decisions appears to be permanent and irreversible. Sarah's sister called me yesterday to pick up some belongings that Sarah had left behind. During our conversation, she told me that Sarah had been feeling increasingly isolated and unsupported in our marriage, even before the financial crisis began. She said that my mother's involvement in our budget decisions was just the final example of a pattern, where I consistently chose my family's opinions over Sarah's feelings. This feedback shocked me because I had not realized that previous incidents had created a foundation of resentment that made Sarah particularly sensitive to my mother's financial intervention. Looking back, I can see several occasions where I had defended my family's criticism of Sarah's choices, or failed to establish boundaries around their opinions about our marriage. For example, my mother had previously made comments about Sarah's career choice, suggesting that nonprofit work was not financially practical for someone who wanted to start a family. Instead of telling my mother that her opinions about Sarah's career were inappropriate, I had suggested that Sarah consider whether her job provided sufficient financial security for our future goals. My father had also made remarks about Sarah's cooking abilities, comparing her unfavorably to my mother's elaborate meal preparation routines. Rather than defending Sarah's different approach to food and entertaining, I had joked about being spoiled by my mother's cooking, and suggested that Sarah might want to learn some of my mother's recipes. These incidents had created a pattern where Sarah felt like my family was constantly evaluating and criticizing her choices while I failed to protect her from their judgment. The financial crisis provided my mother with an opportunity to extend this criticism to every aspect of our household management and daily lifestyle decisions. When I chose to implement my mother's budgeting recommendations despite Sarah's objections, I was essentially telling her that my mother's approval was more important to me than her comfort and autonomy in our own home. I was prioritizing my family's definition of responsible behavior over my wife's right to make decisions about her own lifestyle and spending preferences. The most devastating realization is that my mother's financial plan was not really about helping us save money. It was about proving that her approach to life was superior to ours, and that we needed her guidance to make appropriate decisions about our marriage and household management. My mother had enjoyed the opportunity to analyze and correct our spending habits because it confirmed her belief that young people today lack the discipline and wisdom that her generation possessed. She had presented her recommendations as objective financial advice, but they were really moral judgments about appropriate priorities and responsible adult behavior. By enthusiastically embracing her plan and defending it against Sarah's objections, I allowed my mother to impose her values on our marriage while positioning myself as her ally rather than Sarah's partner. I had chosen to validate my mother's criticism of my wife rather than protecting our relationship from outside interference. The house feels different now that I understand how badly I betrayed Sarah's trust and undermined our partnership. Every room reminds me of arguments where I chose compliance with my mother's rules over consideration for Sarah's feelings. The kitchen especially makes me sad, because it was where we had so many fights about grocery lists, meal planning, and spending decisions. I've been thinking about whether there's any way to repair the damage and convince Sarah to reconsider her decision to divorce me. But reading through her legal complaints has made me realize that the problems in our marriage were deeper and longer standing than I had understood. Sarah did not leave me just because of one argument about coffee or groceries. She left because she realized that I did not respect her enough to prioritize our partnership over my family's approval. She discovered that I would choose my mother's opinions over her feelings whenever there was a conflict between family loyalty and marital solidarity. I am not sure whether I can change these fundamental patterns in my personality and relationships. Learning to establish boundaries with my family and prioritize my wife's emotional needs over their expectations would require significant personal growth and commitment to different values than the ones I was raised with. But I know that any future relationship will require me to understand the difference between seeking advice and surrendering decision-making authority to people outside the marriage. I need to learn how to value my partner's perspective even when it conflicts with my family's recommendations or expectations. Have you ever had to choose between your family's advice and your partner's feelings? How do you handle situations where parents or relatives want to intervene in your marriage decisions? Share your thoughts about balancing family loyalty with marital partnership in the comments below.